Okay, colleagues, let's push forward. So the next section deals with Marxist economics. Now, our course is a course in political philosophy, right? So you're not expected, in your essays, you're not expected to have a detailed understanding of all the nuances of Marxist economic analysis, right? But we need to know enough of the basics, right? Because ultimately, Marx's contention is that the economy plays a crucial role in the political dynamics of a given country, or like in general, in any society. Social formation, capitalism is global capitalism. So the fact that we live in a capitalist world, for Marx, is the most important political reality of our time. Anyway, so let's continue. So, economics, reading Das Kapital. How to read Marx's economic writings, and especially his masterpiece, Das Kapital, Volume 1, which is the only volume which was ever published in Marx's lifetime, right, by Marx himself. Anyway, so how to read Das Kapital remains a matter of controversy. An orthodox reading is that Marx's essential task is to contribute to economic theory based on a modified form of the labor theory of value. Others warn against such a narrow interpretation, pointing out that the character of Marx's writing and the presentation is very far from what one would expect in a standard economic text. So, as always, interpretive problems abound. Again, in many ways, this is unique to Marx. When we are reading Hobbes, or when we are reading Rousseau, or even Hegel, I think that our interpretations of what the philosophers are trying to do are much more straightforward. With Marx, we have a draft. It's a brilliant draft. It contains wonderful ideas, but how exactly do we read it? How do we make heads or tails of it? That's always a problem. Okay, so this particular scholar, William Clare Roberts, argues that Das Kapital Volume 1 is fundamentally a work of political theory rather than economics. Interesting. Political theory rather than economics. I always insist on reading Marx first and foremost as a political theorist, and to understand economics in political terms in Marx. But let's continue. Be that as it may, nevertheless, the work does contain substantial presentation of an economic analysis of capitalism, and it is on this that we will focus here. Okay. So, dreaded labor theory of value. I should probably immediately say that as far as my reading is concerned, labor theory of value is peculiar to the capitalist mode of production. Will communism be driven by labor theory of value? Probably not. Again, labor theory of value is something that is a way of explaining capitalism. And as a person with an undergraduate degree in economics, I think I think that Marxist labor theory of value works well even in 2020, despite what mainstream economics textbooks suggest. Anyway, let's continue. Das Kapital begins Volume 1, right? Begins with an analysis of an idea of commodity production. Commodity, interesting term in Marx. A commodity is defined as a useful external object. It's a useful external object produced for exchange on the market. Right? So a commodity is a useful external object produced for exchange on the market. So it's an exchange value fundamentally. Thus, two necessary conditions for commodity production are existence of a market in which the exchange can take place, and a social division of labor, in which different people produce different products, without which there would be no motivation for exchange. Marx suggests that commodities have both use value, use in other words, and an exchange value, initially to be understood as their price. So again, these important terms. And anyway, so this terminology we should be familiar with. Really important words. Use value can be easily understood, so Marx says, but he insists that exchange value is a puzzling phenomenon. Exchange value is a puzzling phenomenon, and relative exchange values need to be explained. Why does a quantity of one commodity exchange for a given quantity of another commodity? Why does a car cost so much more, and precisely this much more, than a potato, for example? Marx's explanation, is in terms of the labor input required to produce the commodity, or rather, the socially necessary labor time, which is labor exerted at an average level of intensity and average level of productivity for that branch of industry within the economy. So it's socially necessary labor time is defined relative to a particular historical economic formation. Thus, the labor theory of value asserts that the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of socially necessary labor time required to produce it. I think that we are talking about long-term equilibrium price. And in contemporary economics, it's true that long-term equilibrium price is equal to average cost, which ultimately I think it is right to define in terms of labor cost, but that's a separate discussion. Marx provides a two-stage argument for the labor theory of value. The first stage is to argue that if two objects can be compared in the sense of being put on either side of an equal sign, right, then there must be a third thing identical to the magnitude in both of them, right? So a middle ground for comparison, to which they're both reducible. As commodities can be exchanged against each other, there must, Marx argues, be a third thing that they have in common. This then motivates the second stage, which is the search for an appropriate third thing. Okay, I think it's kind of too much detail, right? Which is labor. Okay, labor. Now this is really important. In Marx's view, is the only plausible common element. Both steps of the argument are, of course, highly contestable. As always, everything is highly contestable in Marx. Capitalism can be distinguished from other forms of commodity exchange, Marx argues, in that it involves not merely the exchange of commodities, but the advancement of capital in the form of money, with the purpose of generating profit through the purchase of commodities and their transformation into other commodities, which can command a higher price and thus yield a profit. Marx claims that no previous theorist has been able to adequately explain how capitalism as a whole can make a profit. No previous theorist has been able to adequately explain where profit comes from. Marx is, and by the way, those of you who have rudimentary economic education will remember that under perfect competition, profit is supposed to be equal to zero. Right? Remember this from your economics classes, some of you, right? So, but where does profit come from? Marx's own solution relies on the idea of exploitation of the worker. In setting up the conditions of production, the capitalist purchases the worker's labor power, his or her ability to labor. So it's for that day. So it's important that workers do not sell the product of their labor. They sell their labor power, their ability to work. And in this sense, economic relation is intrinsically a political relation. One person acquires a right to order, to command the other person around for a day. And again, those of you who have had jobs, you know that a relationship between a superior, right, like a boss and a worker, is a political relation. It is not a pleasant relation, usually, right? The cost of this commodity is determined, so the cost of labor power is determined in the same way as any other commodity. That is, in terms of the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce it. So what is the socially necessary labor time required to produce labor power? So we're talking about subsistence wage. Right? Subsistence. How much does it cost to provide a subsistence for the worker? In this case, the value of a day's labor power is the value of the commodities necessary to keep the worker alive for a day. It will talk maybe in this article, I'm not sure, about reproduction of the working class. So it should be slightly more than the amount sufficient to just keep this worker just alive for this one day, because the worker also needs to feed a family. Well, it depends on, is it only the husband who works? Is it both husband and wife? But you definitely need to provide for the children. Even if children start working at an early age, in the very first years of life, they don't work. Anyway, you understand. So socially necessary labor time will include the provision for the reproduction of the working class as a whole. Suppose that such commodities take, let's say, 4 hours to produce. Okay. Accordingly, the first 4 hours of work is spent on producing the value equivalent to the value of wages the worker will be paid. This is known as necessary labor. Any work that the worker does above this is known as surplus labor. Producing surplus value for the capitalist. Surplus value, according to Marx, is the source of all profit. surplus value is the source of all profit. I am prepared to defend this view from first principles and with the appeal to empirical evidence, including today in 2020. I think this is an important and a robust conclusion of Marxist theory. But maybe in a different video. Let's continue reading. In Marx's analysis, labor power is the only commodity which can produce more value than it is worth. Labor power is the only commodity which can produce more value than it is worth. And for this reason, it is known as variable capital. Now, I always have this question in my own head. What about animals? Can you exploit animals? What about slaves? Why does capitalism require free workers, formerly free labor? There are some tentative answers, but I think it's an interesting question to think about. Other commodities simply pass their value on to the finished commodities, but do not create any extra value. They are known as constant capital. Profit, then, is the result of labor performed by the worker beyond that necessary to create the value of his or her wages. This is the surplus value theory of profit. Okay. It appears to follow from this analysis that as industry becomes more mechanized, right? So as humanity becomes more powerful, more productive, the individual becomes less powerful. Using more constant capital and less variable capital, the rate of profit ought to fall. Tendency to the fall of the rate of profit. This is another thorny issue in Marx. I think we should think of this in terms of a tendency rather than, let's say, a law. But this is a I just want to signal this is a big question in Marxist political economy. I have my own views, but let's continue reading. I would say it's a tendency, and I would say it is observed. I would say that it is observed in the world today, ever since the crisis of 2008. I feel that we have empirical evidence to support this tendency, but again, maybe in another video we'll talk about this in more detail. I feel it's important for me, as I'm reading this, to mention the parts of Marxist theory which I think still hold up and are very important and relevant, and parts of Marxist theory which maybe should be read more as drafts or general ideas, or maybe just plain wrong. Who knows? Right? As a proportion, less capital will be advanced on labor, and only labor can create value. So again, the idea that technology increases, the labor input gets less and less, and so there should be a tendency to the fall to the rate of profit. Like robots cannot be exploited. Basically because, well, it's a good question why exactly. One possible answer is because the person who makes the robot and who sells you the robot will not sell the robot for cheaper than the productivity of the robot. But, that's a different kind of consideration. That's not exactly what Marx is talking about. So it's something interesting to think about. Anyway, I want to say this is all complicated. Marxist economic theory is complicated, but I think it's complicated because capitalism is complicated. Okay, and Marxist theory is obviously a bit of an oversimplification, especially in Volume 1 of Das Kapital. Marx doesn't talk about credit. He doesn't talk about banks. He doesn't talk about international trade. So it is a very overly simplistic picture. Okay. This has to be kept in mind. But I think it's robust in the sense that it does capture, as an ideal type, it captures important elements of reality. But let's continue. So, in Das Kapital Volume 3, which is a later published draft, right, Marx does indeed make the prediction that the rate of profit will fall over time. And this is one of the factors which will lead to the downfall of capitalism. However, as pointed out by Paul Sweezy, the analysis is problematic. And I agree with this completely. We shouldn't probably talk about the law, but we should probably talk about just a tendency. And does it necessarily lead to the downfall of capitalism? Probably not. There are ways to avert this. A further consequence of this analysis is a difficulty for the theory that Marx did recognize and tried, albeit unsuccessfully, to meet also in the manuscripts, right? It follows, so we have another difficulty. Let's talk about it. It follows from the analysis so far that labor-intensive industries ought to have higher rate of profit than those which use less labor. Not only is this empirically false, it is theoretically unacceptable. Accordingly, Marx argued that in real economic life, prices vary in a systematic way from values. Providing the mathematics to explain this is known as the transformation problem, and Marx's own attempt suffers from technical difficulties. Although there are sophisticated known techniques for solving this problem, now there's a question about the degree to which they do rescue Marx's project. If it is thought that labor theory of value was initially motivated as an intuitively plausible theory of price, then when the connection between price and value is rendered as indirect as it is in the final theory, the intuitive motivation of the theory drains away. Others consider this to be a superficial reading of Marx, and that his general approach allows us to see through the appearances of capitalism to understand its underlying basis. See through the appearances of apparently diverging prices to its underlying basis, which need not coincide with appearances. How Marxist theory of capitalism should be read remains an active area of scholarly debate. So I feel that, again, let me not go into details, but I think in general understanding economics is very difficult, and especially applying Marx's insights from 150 years ago to today's world, well, actually from 200 years ago almost now, to today's world is 150, is difficult and challenging, but I think it's worthwhile. So nobody, I think, should expect from Marx like truth from God about capitalism. But important insights, yes, guiding insights. But, it's complicated. And Marx is, sometimes right, sometimes wrong, sometimes imprecise. Anyway, let's continue reading. A further objection is that Marx's assertion that only labor can create surplus value is unsupported by any argument or analysis, and can be argued to be merely an artifact of the nature of his presentation. Any commodity can be picked to play a similar role. Consequently, with equal justification, one could set out corn theory of value, arguing that corn has unique power of creating more value than it costs. Formally, this would be identical to the labor theory of value. Nevertheless, the claims that somehow labor is responsible for the creation of value and that profit is a consequence of all exploitation remains intuitively powerful, even if they are difficult to establish in detail. No, again. So even if it's difficult to establish in detail, I would subscribe to labor theory of value. Again, it's important that you have the reserve army of the unemployed, that you have subsistence wages, that it's possible to exploit workers in a way it's really impossible to exploit corn. I stand by this conclusion, even if, again, maybe the details of Marxist economics make it hard to, mathematically, explain this in terms of economic tables. Anyway, however, even if the labor theory of value is considered discredited, there are elements of his theory that remain of worth. The Cambridge economist John Robinson, in an essay on Marxian economics, picked out two aspects of particular note. First, Marx's refusal to accept that capitalism involves a harmony of interests between worker and capitalist, replacing this with a class-based analysis of worker struggle for better wages and conditions of work versus the capitalist drive for even greater profits. I think this is a very important idea, which whizzes almost completely by the head of contemporary economic theory, which is why I think neoclassical economics can safely be labeled to be deeply ideologically motivated and ultimately false, because this is not something that you are taught in undergraduate economics courses, and that's a defect. That's a defect of your economic theory, I would say. And this is why I'm still prepared, despite all the defects and all the problems, which I'm first prepared to admit with economic theory. This is why I'm still prepared to call myself a Marxist in 2020. It's still better than neoclassical economics. Let's put it that way. Although, it has problems. It's a work in progress. Okay, it's fine. We don't have the final theory. We don't have quantum theory of gravity. You don't hold it against Einstein. Okay, we're making progress. That's what counts. At least this is my approach. Take it with a grain of salt. Obviously, take it with a grain of salt. But again, at the same time, I do want to stress, right, that Marx does not have the final word on economic analysis. There are problems to be worked out. Anyway. Second, Marx's denial that there's any long-run tendency to equilibrium in the market, and his description of mechanisms underlie the trade cycle of boom and bust. Both provide a salutary corrective to aspects of orthodox economic theory. So these are two aspects of Marx which supplement in important ways economic theory. Now, I'm not sure about cycles. This is more complicated, but whatever. I feel the first one is really, really important and robust. Okay, next section. exploitation. And we're almost finished. That's good. As noted, traditionally, Marx's definition of exploitation is given in terms of theory of surplus value, which in turn is taken to depend upon the labor theory of value, the theory that value of any commodity is proportional to the amount of socially necessary labor embodied in it. However, the question arises of whether the basic idea of exploitation should be so dependent on a particular theory of value. For if it is, then the notion of exploitation becomes vulnerable to, for example, Robert Nozick's objection that if the labor theory of value can be shown to be faulty, the Marxist theory of exploitation collapses too. I suppose Nozick is a prominent enough figure that maybe you want to include Nozick in your essays. Others have felt that it is possible to restore the intuitive core of Marxist theory of exploitation independent of the labor theory of value. For example, Jerry Cohen, but also but also I think this is Robert Paul Wolff probably. Is it Jonathan Wolff? Anyway, John Romer, to take one leading case, states Marxian exploitation is defined as the unequal exchange of labor for goods. The exchange is unequal when the amount of labor embodied in the goods which the worker can purchase with his income is less than the amount of labor he expended to earn the income. Suppose I work 8 hours to earn my wages. With this, perhaps, the best thing I can buy is a coat. But imagine that the coat took only a total of 4 hours to make. Therefore, I have exchanged my 8 hours of work for only 4 8 hours of other people's work, and thereby, on this view, I am exploited. The definition requires some refinement. For example, if I am taxed for the benefit of those unable to work, I will be exploited by the above definition, but this is not what the definition of exploitation was intended to capture. Worse still, if there's only one person exploited, if there's one person exploited much more gravely than anyone else in the economy, then it may turn out that no one else is exploited. Okay, this is kind of strange, and it sounds like very nitpicky technical objections. Maybe they have value, but like in general, I'm not sure I'm sympathetic to this kind of argument. Nevertheless, it should not be difficult to adjust the definition to take account of all these difficulties. As noted, several other accounts of Marx's expanded accounts of exploitation have been offered that are independent, again, of the theory of value. Many of these alternative definitions adds a notion of unfreedom or domination to unequal exchange of goods, right? The exploited person is forced to accept a situation in which he or she just never gets back what they put into the labor process. So, maybe there's a differential in the bargaining power. This is the road I would go, I think. I haven't thought about this for too long, but I'm not an expert in Marxist economics, but sort of this is my immediate inclination. Now, there may be, in particular cases, a great deal to be said about why this is perfectly acceptable from a moral point of view. However, on the face of it, such exploitation appears to be unjust. Nevertheless, we will see in the next section why attributing such a position to Marx himself is fraught with difficulty. Okay, just to keep the continuity, let's pause the stream here, and maybe we will resume. Okay, this was kind of unsatisfying, I feel. Maybe we can have a better presentation. I feel that it's possible to have a more sympathetic and a more illustrative presentation of Marxist theory of value. So, in general, I think this article by Wolff and Leopold is very good, but this particular section, I'm not very impressed by it, I have to say. I'm sorry. Okay, but still, something to think about. Anyway, colleagues, take care, and I'll see you in the next bit. But still, something to think about. Anyway, colleagues, take care.